The other thing that the gateway systems don't do is once somebody gets past your front door, they have free reign inside your place. And that's how the gateway systems work. Once you get past the gateway, inside the office, you have full access to everything. And that's the one thing that the API systems allow for, the ability to really attack the problem wherever it is inside the environment. Something gets in, you can rip it out.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes, an Iron Skills podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with CISOs, security directors and architects, SOC analysts, and other InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes. I'm your host for today's episode, Brendan Rudd, Community Director at IronScales, an email security platform powered by AI, enhanced by thousands of customer security teams, and built around detecting and removing threats in the inbox. We offer a service that is fast to deploy, easy to operate, and is unparalleled in the ability to stop all types of email threats, including advanced attacks like business email compromise, account takeover, and more. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into the show. Hey Raffi, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brendan. Appreciate it.
So we have a great episode lined up today, talking about MSSPs again, on the theme of MSSPs. And before we get into the show, I'd love for you to share your background and what you're working on these days.
Sure. Raffi Jamgotchian, Triada Networks. We're a hybrid MSP, MSSP based right outside New York City. We focus on small and medium investment companies primarily. So I started Triada back in 2008 when the financial system started to break apart. And a number of people went out on their own and started their small funds. And they reached out to me and said, hey, you supported us when we were together at this large firm. Would you be able to help us build our companies up? And that's how we started.
And what are you up to these days? What's keeping you up at night?
Lately, I did not sleep yesterday at all. Nearly everything is keeping me up at night lately. Certainly the most recent things going on in the past 2 weeks, 12 days or so with regards to things like happening to Kaseya and other supply chain attacks. Even though Kaseya wasn't technically a supply chain attack, but let's call it that for all intents and purposes. They negatively affect us, even if they're not being used by the particular company in general. It ultimately casts a shadow over our entire industry, and it makes it a little bit harder to do everything else that you do. But it's also partially a wake-up call to review things, and even us who were pretty diligent about going about a process around cybersecurity for our customers, we're doing the same thing for our own systems. We had a discussion at tabletop today with our team, just discussing, okay, if one of our key systems was not available, let's pick one. What do we do? How do we service our clients if this is unavailable to us? And so it just having that conversation to even open up just the thinking of that has been super helpful for us to really tighten things around. We'll see if we have to do it in such a way that's mostly cost neutral as best as we can, because this is stuff that comes out of the bottom line.
And I know we're going to get into that in a minute, but I wanted to open up with your book, because the last time we spoke, you didn't mention it. So I really would love to.
Yeah, so we got together with 30 other cybersecurity professionals and MSPs throughout the world, actually. And each of us took a topic and wrote about it. And then we published it together. The book is called On Thin Ice. It's available on Amazon if you wish. You can also go to our website and get a link to it. But basically what the chapter I discussed specifically is on security frameworks. And what are security frameworks? How should you select the security framework? And then once you do that, what you should do with that security framework from a pragmatic, practical way. And that's how we envisioned it. It was written, that chapter, even though it was released last year, was written, almost 18 months ago. As book writing apparently goes, things are not timely, but most of the information is very pertinent still, particularly the conversation about frameworks, because even though frameworks specifically may evolve, they don't necessarily, the concept around frameworks still is very appropriate.
Speaking of frameworks, it seems to me that many companies still don't take data protection seriously. And I'm referring in this case specifically to backups. I would love to hear your view on a basic framework or process for backup and restore.
You hit the word there. It's restore. It's the recovery part of it. If you look at the NIST framework as an example, the NIST cybersecurity framework, NIST has several frameworks, but the basic one is this NIST CSF. It's something that any business of any size can really follow, and is probably one of the leading frameworks, that along with CIS, that most companies should at least take a look at, unless they're in a regulated industry that requires something different. That being said, NIST spells things out in a way that where you're protecting yourself, you identify what you're protecting, you protect it, then you can detect if there's an issue, you can respond to that issue, you can recover to that issue. And the backup story is really around that respond and recover portion. And in order to build true business resilience, which is really the key phrase here, whether it's cyber related or not, the backup and recovery is a key part of that. But it's not a holy grail. So where in the early days of ransomware, we saw customers that were getting dinged, didn't have good backups, or they were backing up locally, and those were also getting encrypted. As the folks have evolved their backup processes and improved it, and it has happened in a short amount of time, the ransomware operators have gone to a secondary stage where that's fine. You can go ahead and restore your stuff. We're going to now take your data and release it. That doesn't happen in all cases. I think and that's something, if they want to inflict reputational damage in order to make sure that they get the ransom, that's a key part. But that said, it's a fundamental part of a security program or any business. When we first started our company, even though we had some basics around cybersecurity, nowhere near, our stack looked nothing like what it does today, if you rewind 13 years. But the one thing that we were adamant about is that we need to have a proper backup and recovery, tested backup and recovery system put in place. That means something that's backing up at a time that fits the company's desire for recovery. How much data can they lose? How much downtime can they endure between those two, the RPO and RTO? Being able to define that and then put something in place that can properly recover that, regardless of the cybersecurity angle. This is just pure, hurricane comes through, fire, flood, or the typical natural disaster. But the truth is, the number one cause of data loss today is human error, and then cybersecurity events.
Do you have a simplified process for the purpose of the podcast that you could maybe walk through? I don't know if it's 3, 5, 7 steps of a backup and recovery process that you found to be effective and up to date?
I think it depends on the company and their risk appetite, but the way that we defined it for our clients, which were, again, mostly in the financial space, many of them were in where they're in a high frequency trading environment, such that downtime for more than an hour or so would not be a big deal. There are certain organizations that even is not tenable, that require a higher end recovery or resiliency system. But let's talk about the general kind of small investment private equity firm or something like that. So for them, we look at what systems they have. We select the appropriate backup system. We make sure that the backup is happening at a frequency that makes sense for the data and the recovery time. If they're in a server environment, that means a server appliance that is backing up to it locally and then pushed off site in real time. I don't believe in the end of day data push that some systems do. I think it needs to be pushed off right away. And it doesn't buy you any, with the bandwidth that we have, there's really no reason why you need to wait to the end of the day to push that data off site. And that's allowed us to take something that used to take us, when we first started, 24 hours to recover, down to 2 hours to recover a typical small company. Example, when Hurricane Sandy came through the Northeast, most of our clients in Midtown Manhattan were fine. Clients in downtown were flooded. Clients in New Jersey lost power for two weeks. Those systems, we had backup in a cloud environment, separate, individual connections remotely from outside the office, in a secure way within a matter of hours. And that the technology allows for doing that. But the only way we can do that and ensure that's working is to have that backup in place and then test. So you have to have a backup, and then you have to test it at the very minimum once a year. I recommend more often than that, usually 6 months or so is enough, and include the client as part of that backup. Make sure it's not just you doing it. Make sure your clients are also able to connect in and look at their data, because ultimately you're going to find other things that are wrong with your plan. And then document it. That's the third pillar, is making sure that your systems are documented. After you do your test, you have an after action. These are things that worked really well. These are things that did not work well. These are the action items to take between now and the next test. That's something that we do every time.
And for folks who haven't done this, thinking about doing it immediately, what's some advice or pitfalls you could prevent people from making?
Question. I think some of the mistakes we made early on was undersizing our backup systems. You want a backup system that can run your production completely and have enough space to store all the data that you need from an actual restoration point of view. If you don't need to store more than 30 days, then that might be okay. But many companies are thinking about, I deleted this file and I think I had it last year. Can you get it back? If you need to answer that question, that you need to appropriately size the environment. So I think most of us tend to undersize it in the beginning, and we underestimate how much space that we need, both from a storage point of view, but also from a compute and RAM point of view. When you're looking at now, maybe you have 4 or 5 servers that you're backing up to one box. That one box has to be beefy enough. And I think some of the backup vendors that sell appliances get a bad rap for being too expensive until you try to figure out that if you build something yourself that's going to be adequate, you'll see how expensive it is.
In your view, if we got at least this part right, would you say that this would reduce the incentives around ransomware?
It will reduce the drive-by criminal, the one who's just going to smash and grab or just try to do maximum broad damage to a lot of companies. I would say that tends to happen with the earlier ransomwares, not so much now, but it will definitely reduce that. It'll also reduce the amount of time companies are down. So there's 2 aspects of ransomware, right? One is, how do I get my systems back up and running? And the second is the extortion. Let's say they could be extorting you, but in the meantime, you can still get back to doing business. And so there's no reason why you can't start both those processes in parallel. Negotiating with the ransomware operator if that's necessary, or decide that you don't need to pay the ransom I'm not going to preach one way or another necessarily. I think that if we take the money out of the equation, if we stop paying the ransoms, they'll eventually find another way to try to monetize their criminal activities. But ultimately, it's each business and their insurance and their legal, what they need to do there. But that said, I don't think it'll eliminate it, but it will take the wind out of the low-hanging fruit.
As president, CTO at Triada Networks, MSSP, what inspired you to build your MSSP, and what changes are you seeing in this category, and where do you see it going?
Most of us started out as, if you look at the broader market, most of us started as managed service providers. Some of us migrated to be MSSPs. We decided to straddle the fence a little bit and do both for a number of reasons. Our clients are smaller. I think we had enough of a security culture that we could handle both types of plans. The mindset that you need to secure and defend a company is different than one that if you're just purely doing IT and trying to help them do the work. And so I understand why people separate those two. And in fact, we do engage in where there is an existing MSP or internal IT, and then we do a co-managed deal where we'll handle the security and somebody else will do the IT. But we're also in situations where we're doing everything. The security team is separate from the IT team in a sense. They're not involved in the same recovery and thinking and defensive stuff that we're working on, but we're under the same roof and under the same management. So what kind of dragged me into this? It's a good question. I alluded to it in the beginning. A lot of the larger financial firms were breaking up. People that I knew were starting small. They needed a way to protect themselves and also be able to talk to their investors and sit across the table from their investors and say, answer these pretty strong third-party due diligence questions. Now that we've been doing that for 10 years, we're now seeing it come around with other industries saying, tell us about your suppliers, tell us about what you do, what are your processes, how do we know that our money is going to be safe if we put them into your company? We took that, we kind of internalized that conversation around that and built our program. And that's where we went down the road of adopting frameworks with our customers and then measuring them to those frameworks and then building processes around those frameworks so that we can report back to them and then also report back to their investors and say, these are the things that we did. This is how we're moving the ball forward. This is how we've adjusted our security posture to make sure that your information and your money is safe. And that's how the stack is ever evolving as a result of that. The risks change today versus yesterday. Our data is in different places than it was. We were like all on-prem 12 years ago, and today we're almost all cloud. That changes things, as does the risk equation. Ransomware happened in the old days. Before crypto, people were ransoming and asking for iTunes gift cards, but it was very minor and it didn't really happen all that often. And now we're seeing that shifted, starting to ramp up maybe 5-6 years ago and then really take off the last few years. So that risk equation is different than security issues. Past malware and past cyber actors did different things. They were going after different things. They were monetizing different things. They're trying to steal credit cards and identities, and they were trying to use you as a beacon for doing DDoS attacks. But now they're looking at ways that they can monetize you directly by taking your stuff. And that's a different animal than...
If you could sum up your differentiator as an MSSP in a sentence or two, how would you position yourself in the market? What are the value adds that you provide that are maybe different, or even if they're not different?
I guess what we do differently is we do blend in the IT and the MSSP portions a little bit more than most, probably because we understand what's pragmatic for an IT department or an MSP to do. We understand that a little bit better than, say, a pure MSSP that grew up in the MSSP world. So we understand all that. We can have a different conversation around kind of the pragmatism about what you should put in terms of support and in terms of prevention and protection for a customer. We also are vertically focused. We work with mostly financial services companies. So we understand how their business is. We look at their risks. They're if they're not the top attacked vendor, I think you guys even show it in a lot of your reports at IronScales. You see the financial vertical is typically one of the ones that is attacked the most. If it's not in the top, it's usually in the top 3, which never a dull moment, of course. And we always have to be on our toes. The way we look at protecting our clients is around, we protect their endpoints and we make sure that those are safe. We protect their identities, and that's things including MFA, it includes phishing, it includes other related things. And then we put it all together around this framework that I talked about. And we built this. A friend of mine, Rob Bowles, put together his blocks of security. We did something similar called the pyramid of security, which is basically 15 fundamental things that you need to do at every company. And it's listed in kind of a way that as you go up in maturity up the pyramid, it's more and more, you typically can do more and more. Very similar to the way CMMC now has different maturity models. The CIS top 20 now has levels. That was our concept of taking Maslow's hierarchy of needs and put it in a cybersecurity terms. These are the baseline things that everybody should have. When you're ready and done with that, you should really look at the next level to really secure yourself even more, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's the way we go.
So would you say companies that have zero maturity model would be better suited working with an MSSP to build up their security program? Or when is the best time to work with an MSSP? What are some of the questions customers should ask themselves if an MSSP is the right fit or time for them?
Yeah, I think it really depends on who's doing their internal technology. If they're doing their internal technology themselves, if they're a sizable enough firm that they can hire full-time IT person, there's a good chance that one person is not going to have a broad enough experience and knowledge around cybersecurity. That's an ideal place to start. If you don't have an IT person, or they're part-time, or you have an current MSP that is really not talking to you about cybersecurity, that's a good question to start with them and say, hey, we want to really look at what our security posture is. And if they're like, oh, you don't need any of that, they're just trying to scare you. The answer is yes, we are trying to scare you a little bit, but we also are trying to educate folks. It might be an idea that maybe you need to find a different MSP that is a little bit security focused, that understands what their limitations are. I know what my limitations are. So as an MSSP, I know that there are certain things that we could not manage to handle ourselves. And so we will look at partners to help us fill those gaps. Your MSP has to be open to be able to understand that. You as a company, if you have an internal staff, you have to be open to understand what your gaps are in order to fill that in. And if you're in any sort of regulated industry, hopefully you're raising your hand and you're talking to somebody already.
And what misconceptions do you hear the most from talking with potential customers or even your current?
I think that the expectation is that it gets two things. One is that it's either too expensive, or they don't even have the conversation because they think it's already too expensive. The real reality is that it can be expensive if you haven't planned for it, but there are also practical and pragmatic ways that you can protect yourself without necessarily blowing your bank. So and that's why the maturity model is actually really helpful, because it allows you to start, hey, look, I have this much money. I only have this much. What can I do with this much? This tells you make sure you check these boxes first. Get through this. And if any of these things are outside of your skill set to do yourself, that's when you hire somebody to help you do it. I don't drill my teeth when they hurt. I go to my dentist. And if my dentist says, you need a root canal, she's going to send me to a root canal specialist. It's not something she does. So there's no reason why we have to be mechanics on our own body. We're not mechanics on our own bodies. We shouldn't be doing that for our own networks. Get somebody in. It's probably going to cost you less money than you think, because the doing the wrong thing is going to cost you a lot more in the end.
Cybersecurity Heroes is brought to you by IronScales, an AI-powered, self-learning email security platform that helps security professionals proactively prevent, detect, and remediate phishing attacks in a matter of seconds, not hours or days. And we have an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners. Discover dormant phishing threats in your organization's mailboxes. Get a free 90-day scan back with a detailed report. Integrate in seconds with 2 clicks via API to Microsoft Office 365 and see what your current email security is missing. Go to ironscales.com/free scan to learn more.
Where do you typically start when companies are coming to you on a budget and they're just starting to develop their programs? Where do you recommend they focus their spend?
Pick a frame. If you're going to pick a framework, or you don't, if you don't have a framework, I would say start with the CIS top 20, or look at our pyramid. And you say, all right, the CIS top 20 at first level, these are the things I'm going to spend money on. Let me get through that. If I have money left over, then I could do the next thing. Better yet is if you then talk to somebody to really to decide, all right, I don't need to spend money in this box or this, because I really don't have, my risk is low here. This phishing might be a bigger risk for me. Maybe I need to spend more money on anti-phishing. We have a lot of our services in the cloud. Okay, so if that's the case, having a really expensive firewall in the office may not make sense. Maybe I should look at something like a SASE system or a distributed cloud firewall kind of thing. So there's ways that you can think about it pragmatically, but that at least gives you a baseline and a roadmap to start with. And the way we look at it, the way we do it, is that we look at a framework, we set it up, and then we measure our clients to that framework. And then every quarter we reevaluate. How did you do? How do we do getting you to a better place? Is it time for us to move on, or are we at a good place right now? Did the framework change? Should we make an adjustment to it? So all those things really make a massive difference for a company just starting out.
Yeah, you mentioned phishing a couple of times since we started this podcast, and a lot of your clients are in the financial space, which we know is also a haven for phishing attacks. It was, encouraging to hear you speak so passionately about the changes you're seeing in the email security category and the technologies coming out of this market, specifically the API email security category that has been emerging over the last 5 or 6 years. So I would like to get your view on what was your aha moment that led you to become a user and an evangelist of this category and technology.
I mean, if the API based connection gives you two really distinct advantages. One is easy to deploy, right? You don't have to fiddle around with gateways and what have you. Most of the gateway, and I'm not disparaging the gateway systems, they've been great for us. We still use them, but they're not our sole defense anymore. The other thing that the gateway systems don't do is once somebody gets past your front door, they have free reign inside your place. And that's how the gateway systems work. Once you get past the gateway, inside the office, you have full access to everything. And that's the one thing that the API systems allow for, the ability to really attack the problem wherever it is inside the environment. Something gets in, you can rip it out. I remember in the enterprise days, the first there wasn't even phishing then, it was just anti-spam systems, malicious systems in place. That's what we were able to do. They were actually part of the Exchange server. We were able to go in ripping emails out. We were able to commands to pull messages completely out. That disappeared for us for a while when we went to work with SMBs and then the cloud, until these API capabilities came around. The other part of the API capabilities, I said two, there's actually three, is now that, and some of the others can do this too, but they seem to be not doing it, is really the ability to crowdsource your threat intelligence. Threat intelligence, if somebody has seen something, very likely somebody else has already seen it. And if they haven't, you're now helping somebody else down the attack line. So the ability to be able to source a message that, especially these bulk spray and pray attacks that company A saw and flagged as a potential bad actor, now company B can see that, hey, somebody else has already flagged as a bad actor. Maybe I should be a little bit more cautious. These are massive, I think, shifts. They seem really simple, and they are from an operational point of view, but they're massive game changers in order to change your security posture.
What was life like, before you were introduced to this technology, before you were able to do those things?
Well, I think most of the gateway vendors didn't have, they were good at blocking known attackers, looking at certain language and giving you a confidence score about whether something is spam or not. The problem is that most of the phishing attempts, and especially the spear phishing attempts, went through undetected. Many of them didn't even have links. Impersonation attacks. Like, they didn't know what to do with impersonation. My CEO sends me an email from his Gmail account with his name on it. That could be anybody. That could be anybody creating a Gmail account and putting their name on it. But being able to now see that, hey, this is a name that's inside the office. Now we pair that with this guy going in. This is potentially a risk email. So all those things, gateway systems, because they didn't have that visibility inside and outside of the environment, it made it difficult to do. Whereas not really a function of the API system specifically, because it requires the environment to be able to do this. The gateway systems are good about really the low-hanging spammy fruit, just making sure that stuff just doesn't even get to you. But the really tricky stuff, that stuff gets through.
So I also want to go back to what you said a few minutes ago regarding the crowdsourced intelligence and threat detection. Do you see more companies from all security services being able to go down this route? Are you seeing more decentralization of intelligence in products, or is it still early?
It's a mixed bag. I think you're seeing some forward-thinking companies that are definitely doing that. We work with one vendor that's doing that on the firewall side. So they're taking the traffic and threat intel from across a client base and across there, and then they categorize the who you're connecting to or who's connecting to you through a scale of 1 to 10 kind of thing, and it says, all right, anything above an 8 and above, this is not good. Just block it. If we see it over here and we see it over here, we're going to block it in both places. So those kind of things we're starting to see a little bit more. We're definitely seeing it in the EDR space, where particularly the cloud-based EDR companies, CrowdStrikes, the Carbon Blacks, etc., they're pooling their threat intelligence together. Folks are using VirusTotal positively or negatively, whatever, but that's another avenue of crowdsourcing your threat intel a little bit. So we're seeing that as well. And then finally, we're seeing some active threat hunting companies now looking at threat intel feeds as a way to, in this case, it's more of like a downstream one where they're ingesting the threat intel and then doing something with it, not really sharing it back. I think ultimately sharing it back is going to be also the key aspect of the maturity of that model going forward. The trick with that is always, where do you draw the line between the privacy of the company and in terms of sharing? So you have to be smart about that. If you're sharing hashes, that's okay. If you're sharing other indications, metadata, like the firewall company that I was talking about, not the firewall company, but the company that worked with firewalls to do that, threat intelligence systems, they're just looking ins, outs, IP addresses, really metadata. They're not looking at any payload information. So you just have to be a little bit smart about that kind of thing. But ultimately, I think that part of it is improving.
I'm sure you're no stranger to the phrase cyber burnout, and mostly what I hear is it's doing repetitive tasks, wearing multiple hats. So if there's technology out there that can alleviate those types of repetitive, mundane tasks, I'm all for it. I'm just curious to know how it's being received by the analysts that are using it.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about the typical SOC analyst sitting in front of a SIEM or multiple SIEMs in some cases and trying to identify malicious events and correlate them together. The more our tools can do to help us do that, the whole advent of the SOAR market has really been to help detect or orchestrate automated responses to those kind of things. The analysts can actually spend time. It's actually done a negative thing, but I'll touch on that in a minute. It allows the SOC analysts to really work on the problems that needs a human to actually intervene on. And it's a massive time changer. There's really no way for us to keep up with the influx of data and correlations and figure out all those calculations. The problem that it brings, and this is something that is a little bit interesting, and I don't know how many people have thought about this, is that SOC analysts are like help desk people. They start at a certain place, right? That's usually where you're starting out in the security. If you're going into a security organization for the first time, you're starting out as an analyst, and then you work your way up. That's how the current on the defensive side. That's currently how it typically works. If you're starting out as a SOC analyst and you have all these tools that are doing it for you, you may potentially miss out on an opportunity to learn something fundamental. That's my only concern about a lot of these automation tools. But it's rewind back 20 years when we first connected our servers to email and spam became a thing. We were manually filtering spam for a while. There were months that we were actually, any image that came through, any attachment, it would go into a box and we'd go through one by one. Somebody in IT would go by one through email and then decide to release it or not. That was a thing. And then we started, building Bayesian filters and block lists, and we couldn't keep up with the block list. So then we came up with Bayesian filters. So this is the next evolution of that.
What are the biggest challenges around email security that you're hearing from your current customers and potential customers?
The emails are getting better. We know that the malicious actors are always looking for ways to get around our defenses. They hire people to improve their English. They're getting more targeted, very specific to the particular company that they're trying to attack rather than just generic spraying. 10 years ago, we just saw tons and tons of Viagra. There's the Viagra ads and Canadian pharmacy things. That was the big thing. And as that has evolved, they are not able to monetize that anymore. They're trying to find a new way to monetize it. And so keeping up with that trend is going to be hard. Email we have is the other difficulty is copycat domains is another one that is we see a lot of. It's usually an indication that you're in the middle of an attack of sorts. If somebody's gone to the trouble of registering a domain that looks just like yours, but it's off by one letter or one number, there's a good chance that you're on someone's target list and it's time to bring your shields up. How can we get some information around that, intelligence around that? There's right now, there's not a lot of great ways to do that other than hope that someone picks up on the fact that the G in your company name is now a Q when you're looking at a domain. So it's that kind of thing. There's a lot of, email security is ever evolving. I don't think we solved it. I think there's going to be more work to be done there. I think we see a lot of things around like delayed malware releases where the initial vector comes through, but there's no malicious attack. So it gets through all your defenses. And then the malicious link wakes itself up later on when you click on that link later on. So there's some oddities on that. The other thing is using trusted sources as a way to get fast defenses. Using OneDrive, using Dropbox, using Microsoft Azure, using AWS as a way to look like, oh, this looks like this is a normal domain. This is someone that I know, and then letting that through. So it's a tricky situation in those cases.
Last time we spoke, we talked about long-term partnerships with vendors. Do you think it's important that whoever you're partnering with on whichever technology it is, that you believe in the company's roadmap and you're really investing half in the technology and also like half in the roadmap and innovation of the company, because security is always changing. So you want to really review your relationship with a vendor other than just first impressions on technology, for example.
Yeah, it's actually an awesome point. And if you look at many times companies will have to, that firewall vendor that I was talking, that company that was working with firewall is a good example of that. When I initially came upon them, they were a potential investment target for one of my clients. So they asked us to do due diligence on them they were looking to invest in them. So the first look at what I saw was, here's this actually really great bunch of guys that came out of DoD, NSA. They put together this really interesting process around securing businesses, small and medium businesses primarily. And then there was some hardware component based. And we put it through its paces and what have you. And my feedback was like, this is great, but I think you're missing the potential market here. And so we had that conversation. And then they went dormant for a little while. And then 6 months or a year later, they popped back up and said, now we can do what we were doing before and then some at less price because we rejiggered what we were looking to do. Their fundamental business was still around threat intelligence, but it was how to consume that threat intelligence more broadly. And that was key because it was really betting on the people that are at the company more than the product. Now that's on an early stage. On a later stage company, the same thing applies because you don't want them necessarily to be stagnant. There's a lot of talk today, especially the involvement of private equity in our field and how private equity, and I don't know, hopefully I'm not stepping on toes here, but when private equity gets involved, potentially it can be detrimental to the market because they take companies, they consolidate them, they pull out what they think is fat, but sometimes what falls on the cutting room floor is not only innovation, but fixing past mistakes, as well as not putting in proper operational security around what they're doing. And that ultimately leaves the market and clients open. And it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that private equity is a bad word. Again, most of my clients are in private equity. So we're not saying that. But if you're looking at a way, this is more for the vendors out there. If you're looking at a way to gain some investment because you want to take it to the next level in terms of growth, really look for a growth-minded private equity firm and VC rather than somebody that's just going to take you and add them to their portfolio and kind of tear you apart, just in a way to squeeze the last dollar out of you. Look for ways that you can deal with the top line without necessarily destroying your operational. There's ways that you can improve that, I'm sure, with the additional cash. Do that. Don't sacrifice your operation for the greater monetary gain on the other end.
So can you share how you evaluate new technology and vendors?
Yeah, and this is actually evolving. What I say today will probably change between now and next week, but we have a fundamental set of questions that we ask around the company, things that we've added now that we hadn't added, that we didn't talk about in the past. Is what's your development lifecycle model? What do you follow a secure development lifecycle? Where is security in your development process? What tools are you using to vet code? What tools are you using to ensure that secure code is implemented and hijack along the way? When you're committing code, are you using best practices around using multi-factor, and do your developers have access to production? Those kind of questions have now been added, which they weren't in the past. In the past, we always talked about financial viability, even though a lot of times we'll work with an emerging company that might not necessarily be financially viable just yet, but we want to make sure that they're at least viable enough and have enough runway enough that they can service us for at least in the near term. And so that's a key part of it. We ask about, obviously, if they've had any third party review and attestation ask for those attestations. SOC 2 Type 2 is great, but it's very expensive, and for a small SaaS company that might not be always doable. And we look for other ways that they can provide that kind of review, because we're going to be asked those same questions when we're talking to our customers and their customers. So we want to make sure that we cover our bases on that in terms of around processes. So then we have our own process around, okay, what happens if we don't do this? Are we missing out on a massive opportunity, or is this really just a replacement to something else? Are we going to get an operational gain from this? Is this going to save us time or money to use this system rather than doing it the way we're doing it? That's another way that we'll look at those things. And then the other thing is we talk to our peers, the peers that have used this system, peers who have talked to them, get their impressions. No, none of us are in a bubble, and not one of us, we can't. It's a silly notion to say, okay, this is my secret. Iron Sales is my secret. I don't want anybody else to use it. Well, if I was Iron Sales' only customer, they'd go out of business. So we want to become eventually an evangelist for that company. And we think about it in that way. Is this a company that I want to evangelize? Do I really believe in it that much? And if it checks all those boxes, then we're green lighted to move forward.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Not sure why companies, at least between their peers, why they wouldn't want to share, but I can understand publicly you don't necessarily want to give attackers any upper hand.
I have a kind of a different mind to that. I understand that people do that. Some of our clients that are definitely more switched on, they're like, yeah, we don't want to talk about what technologies we use, or we've been advised against doing that. Ultimately, the attacker's going to figure it out. They're going to know what you're using. There's almost nothing that you can do that obfuscates what tools you're using to protect the customer. Unless you're really super good at deception, I think that's an unnecessary battle, just because you don't want to. I use Firewall X on my website as of now. I know that these guys use that vendor. As soon as the vulnerabilities, I'm going to pounce on it. They're going to figure that out anyway.
And to your point, like all it takes is I think it will take about 10 seconds or less to do an MX record lookup to see if you're using Microsoft or any other gateway level email provider. So yeah.
Gateway level, certainly. Yeah, gateway level, they're going to find out. I mean, having an API based solution is going to not do that. Our firewall vendor is probably obvious, but the vendor that's doing the threat intel against that firewall, probably not so obvious. So there's probably areas that are hidden from an attacker from that point of view. But ultimately, if they did figure it out, what's that going to do? Unless they know of a way to game it, that's going to not really make a big difference, in my opinion.
Yeah. So Raffi, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I really appreciate your insights and knowledge around the space. If anybody would like to ask more questions about you, your company, your services, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, I'm Raffi Jamgotchian. Good luck if you want to spell that, but it'll be in the show notes somewhere. That's how you can find me on LinkedIn and a lot of other places. I'm active in a lot of different forums, ASCII, Tech Tribe, Discord, a couple other places, Slack. So you can probably find me around any of those. Or if you want to find out more about triadanet.com is our website, and that's where we're sticking shop.
I'll be sure to add those to the show notes. So again, thank you so much, Raffi, for taking the time to join us today on Cybersecurity Heroes. And to the rest of you, we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Brendan.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.